I've always been fascinated by what happens at the end of a console's life cycle. It's that weird period where you've got more powerful consoles on the market, but a lot of developers and publishers are still putting out big games for old systems. And in a lot of ways, those games push the hardware in ways that the earlier games just couldn't. The developers were using everything they had learned from years of making games for those systems. These are the games that fly under the radar, the games that become virtually impossible to find on the secondary market because they had limited print runs and not many people bought them. But what's really interesting about these games at the end of a console's life is that a lot of people just totally missed them. They had already moved on to the next console, so they didn't get to experience these last few games. Now, these Twilight games aren't always great. In fact, a lot of them are bad, but they're really special just to show what people were thinking about doing with a console, how they were trying to push the hardware. And today, we're looking at the 6 last landmark games that came out for the Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid-90s. But before we dive in, if you like Nintendo content like this, think about hitting that subscribe button. We put out brand new videos every week. All right, let's get to it.
The Nintendo Entertainment System released in 1985, but by the mid-90s, we were still getting a lot of great games. The only issue was there was a lot of competition on the market at the same time. The Super Nintendo, for example, launched in 1990. And in 1995, we entered 3D with the Sony PlayStation. A year later, we got the Nintendo 64. Some of these games that we're talking about today were released just a year before the Sony PlayStation came out. Mario's Time Machine, released in June 1994. Developed by Radical Entertainment, Mario's Time Machine is a really weird NES game. It was also released for the Super Nintendo and MS-DOS, if you're interested. Now, the game itself takes a lot of design cues from the Super Nintendo's Super Mario World, but it's only about a tenth as fun. Mario's Time Machine looks like a side-scrolling Mario platformer, but it's really an educational game designed to teach kids about history. In the game, Mario goes back in time and reads stuff. So here's the story. Mario discovers that Bowser has stolen some valuable artifacts from different historical periods, and it's up to the plumber to travel through time to retrieve them. So you take Mario through different time periods like ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, even the Renaissance, and then you're trying to solve puzzles and learn a little bit as you work through these stages. It's not a bad game, not at all, it's just weird. This was the first time I ever played through it. I knew it existed, but I just wasn't super interested. But in playing it, I was shocked to see Mario riding Yoshi, and even the spin jump from Super Mario World making an appearance here. It's on the NES. The biggest gripe I have about this game is jumping on enemies doesn't kill them. You're really not trying to kill enemies here. Enemies can't kill you. It's got the look of a Mario game, just doesn't have the feel. The Jungle Book, released on the NES in August 1994, was also released on a ton of other platforms. The Sega Master System, Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear, PC, and then finally the NES. Now, the Genesis version is widely considered the best version of this game. It looks awesome, the music is great. It's just really impressive that they got this game onto the NES at all. The game was developed and published by Virgin Interactive. In the game, you play as Mowgli, the protagonist from the 1967 Disney movie. It's a basic platformer, but you have to avoid all different sorts of enemies like snakes and tigers. You run, jump, and fight your way through the jungle, and you're trying to collect as many fruits and other items as possible to earn points. So it's got a little bit of a collect-a-thon vibe to it. The game also has a couple of mini games, such as a rhythm-based dancing game with King Louie and a running segment where Mowgli has to outrun Shere Khan. At the time, the game was really well received by critics, but not specifically on the NES. This is one of those games that was really meant for that next generation. I mean, this is 1994, a year before the PlayStation. It's just really impressive that it ended up on the NES at all. The Flintstones, Surprise at Dinosaur Peak, released in August of 1994 in North America. Now, some people think this game was an exclusive rental from Blockbuster, but I couldn't find any hard evidence of that. Could be true, but I'm just not sure. This is, though, one of the most valuable NES games out there. A quick eBay search shows copies of Surprise at Dinosaur Peak going for north of $2,000. Yikes. In the game, you control Fred and Barney, and you can flip back and forth between the characters with the select button. Barney has a slingshot attack, and Fred has a big club. Now, Dinosaur Peak looks amazing. The character models look exactly like the characters from the TV show, and the game is super colorful. The animations are also really, really nice. If you pay really specific attention, you can even see how the animators got Fred and Barney's a walk down. It's really close to what you see in the cartoon. On the downside, though, the game's just a little repetitive. The Incredible Crash Dummies released on the NES in August 1994, but it released for a lot of other consoles too. It was on the Sega Master System, the Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the Game Gear. The Incredible Crash Dummies is based on a toy line and an animated series that was just huge in the early 90s. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing these guys. Probably looks pretty weird to some younger players today, though. In the game, you're following the adventures of the Crash Dummies. These were basically characters designed to promote safety on the road. So you could take control of Spike or Slam as you drive through these different levels, collecting safety items, and ultimately just trying to avoid hazards. There are tons of stages in this game, but it's just not that great. The controls are really slippery, and the gameplay is just so repetitive. But worst of all, it's just not that fun. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters, released February 1994 in North America. Developed and published by Konami, Tournament Fighters is a really fantastic fighting game that takes the Turtles away from the normal side-scrolling and beat-em-up games that we were used to at the time. The game released for the NES, the Super Nintendo, and the Sega Genesis. The Super Nintendo is still considered the best version of the game, but it's really impressive to see a fighter like this running on the NES. The game has a lot of characters, including the 4 Turtles, Casey Jones, Master Splinter, and a lot of enemies. In the single-player mode, you have to fight through a series of opponents, and then ultimately the final boss you have to beat is Shredder. Tournament Fighters was also re-released on 2022's Cowabunga Collection, and on that cartridge, you can play through all 3 console versions of the game: the NES, the Super Nintendo, and the Genesis version. Wario's Woods, released December 10th, 1994, was the last officially licensed game for the NES. And it came from Nintendo Research and Development 1. That's the same team that was responsible for games like Metroid, Super Mario Land, and Kid Icarus. Now, Wario's Woods wasn't exclusive to the NES, and that's true of a lot of the games on this list. It was also released for the Super Nintendo and the Satellaview in Japan. Wario's Woods is a pretty basic puzzle platformer. Unsurprisingly, Wario is the villain here, but you control Toad. The game is a falling block puzzle game where you have to arrange these different color monsters and bombs in rows of 3 or more in order to clear the screen of enemies. It's your basic match 3 game. At the time, it got pretty positive reviews, but it just didn't get the same sort of recognition and commercial success that some of the other big puzzle games on the NES got, like Tetris or even Dr. Mario.
So those are the 6 games that helped bury the Nintendo Entertainment System. Again, not all of them great, some of them really fun though. Did you have a chance to play any of these games? If so, what'd you think? Were there any other late games that I missed? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing.